I want to welcome you to the first discussion around our mentorship, Mold Toxicity Redefined. This mentorship is around literally a redefinition of mold toxicity as it pertains to kids. It's a completely different way of looking at mold toxicity and how that drives mental health problems in kids. It is a different physiological model. It ultimately comes with a totally different treatment model. And ultimately, over the last 7 years of helping now probably over 1,000 of these kids, this is the model that I have found to be far more effective than anything else. This first presentation is really an overview, an introduction to help you get a very high level bird's eye view of the entire discussion that we're going to be having. It's to give you simple tools that you can start implementing today to help your patients, and also helping you understand certain things like how to start checking these kids to see if they have had exposure, how to better assess their environments, and just to have a high level view of what may be happening to them. The second part of this discussion is a deep dive into the gut and how that is driving the very toxicity that we see. We're going to get into diagnostic testing, the first part being more organic acids, urinary mycotoxins, antibody testing, mold-related testing. Second part of it being more conventional labs, glyphosates, stool testing, all of the other ancillary things that need to be at times in place to assess the full picture of the child. We're going to have a detailed discussion around assessing the environment and what tests are effective. And when someone says, hey, we tested our home, there is no mold, you can say, well, that's wonderful. I suspect there's mold. Can you please do this? Then we're going to have a detailed discussion around what the toxins do. How do the toxins affect the nervous system? How do the toxins affect the mitochondria? How do they affect the immune system? On and on and on and on. And then there's the detailed discussion around treatments. We'll dive into itraconazole. We'll dive into the antifungals. We'll dive into various other treatments. The reason why this is last is if you don't know how to identify mold exposure, then what's the point of treating it? If you don't know how to identify the child that's living in toxic amounts of mold, how effective do you think your treatment will be? And if you don't even know exactly what you're treating, you're just throwing things onto the wall hoping they stick when you don't even understand the physiology well enough, how effective would you expect your treatments to be? So the reason why the detailed treatments are last are exactly because of these reasons. I've said this before, I'll say it again. This is entirely a pediatric model. It's based on all of the families that I have helped and all the families I couldn't help. All the families where my treatments failed and I couldn't understand why. In no way, shape, or form does it contradict the adult models. It doesn't contradict the other models that are out there. And in talking with my mentor, Dr. Nathan, many times, what we have both giggled and laughed about is that kids are not little adults and adults are not big kids. We might as well be two different species. The way the children's systems respond to the mold toxins and ultimately what happens to them, I believe are two very physiologically different things. And this is entirely about the kids. And with that, I want to really give credit where it's due, because I wouldn't be here without these two brilliant, wonderful people. Dr. Nathan is the person who opened my eyes to mold-related toxicity. He's the one that helped me learn so many things about it. And then there's Dr. Andrew Campbell, who has a very different perspective. But the papers he has published, the things that he has taught me are incredible. Most of the pediatric mold-related literature is from Dr. Andrew Campbell. And the questions that he posed on me, like, Pageman, these mycotoxins and the binders can't work. Like, these binders can't be helping. And, he's the one that had me say, well, God, why is that? Pagement, itraconazole is what you need to be looking at. Why the hell is itraconazole the best tool? And it was through these gentlemen that I ultimately came to where I am now. And when you really sit there and just look at the three camps, right? Mold toxins are a problem. No, mold toxins are not a problem. Binders are helpful. Binders are useless. Support the detox. Support the microbiome. Forget about the microbiome. Focus on the immune system. You get to this place where you're like, what the heck? Who actually understands what's going on? Are all these guys like totally crazy, or are they all right? And if they're all right, then how can they all be right at the same time? And I believe they are all right at the same time. It's just that we have never had a model that integrates everything that they all teach into one cohesive system. And then secondarily, if they're all right, then which treatment model do you use? Do you do detox? Do you use itraconazole? Do you focus on the immune system and the hormones? Like, what do you do? And I believe that this is why many people feel mold related illness is like getting your neurosurgery, you know, specialty. It feels like you need to become a neurosurgeon because it's that complicated. And then it's like, do you go up? Do you go down? Do you go left? Which treatment do I use? Do I do probiotics? Do I not do probiotics? Do I support the liver? Do I use choline? It's insane how complicated this entire model has become. Overly complicated, way too confusing. It doesn't need to be. And if anything, through this mentorship, the one thing that I want to empower you all is understanding a better, easier, more effective way of approaching this for kids. Again, I have no idea how applicable this is to adults. For kids, I believe that what you will learn will help you much more easily understand how to take care of these kids and how to get them better. So with that, you're going to learn how to accurately diagnose this. Not that we ever diagnose mold-related illness, but it's really using diagnostic testing to say, God, I think that kid has been exposed and sick from it. How to accurately help families understand what's going on in their environment and control it. And ultimately, how do we bring the most effective, efficient tools to treat this? So with all of this, we are going to redefine mold-related illness as it comes to kids. With that, I'm going to give you tools that by the time you're done with this mentorship, you're going to hopefully be able to help at least 70 to 80% of your kids with PANS and PANDAS, with autism who have had mold exposure, eczema, learning disabilities, ADHD, those kids who have been exposed, and you're going to see that sadly it's a very large percentage of them, the total cases. Hopefully, we'll give you the tools that you can get these kids better by 50%. And ultimately, more important than the treatments is your understanding of what is going on. Because when you understand what's going on with these kids, you may choose to not use the tools that I'm teaching you and use other tools. And frankly speaking, I hope a year from now, if I do reteach this mentorship, the tools that I will have learned to use will be different than now. Because all I know are what I have learned to help these kids, which are way better than what was there a year ago. And I'm already testing out certain things that I won't share with you in this mentorship because I have just recently learned that may in 6 months change the treatment tools that I bring to the table. What I will tell you is that this model that I've been brewing over for the last 2 years, the more I explore it, the more I test it, the more I poke holes at it, the more solid it becomes. But at the end of the day, that's really the fundamental thing. We're asking too few questions. Too many people are saying, well, Dr. So-and-so said this, and because they said this and they're God, I will follow whatever they said to the T, instead of saying, what? They said this, but so-and-so said that. And then this I've seen in my kids, and these patients are responding this way. So how does this make sense? We need to be asking more questions. So let's dissect this down. So we got the Dr. Nathan et al. Model, which is mold-related illness is basically persistent toxicity from the mycotoxins. And if you bind and remove them, everything gets better. If that's the case, then is it just that enough mycotoxins basically landed in the system and now they're circulating indefinitely, and that's why? And basically, these mycotoxins are getting into the brain, and because they're getting into the brain, they're triggering, neuroinflammation and neuronal damage and blah blah blah, and that's why we get the mental health. That's that. This is what I was taught. This is what I believed. But I kept saying, is this really what's going on? Because when you get into some of the weird parts of the literature, such as not how mycotoxins survive in the environment, right? Because they survive in the environment for years upon years. But in vivo, when you look at animal studies, when you look at human studies, when you find that mycotoxins only last a few hours. And you find that the microbiome actually does a pretty decent job in clearing mycotoxins out of the body. If these in vivo studies are true, and the researchers didn't hallucinate, then how is it that exposure from years ago can still cause toxicity now? And if mycotoxins break down in a few hours, then why would binders be helpful? And with this model comes the complexity, right? Support methylation, you got to support sulfation because methylation causes SAMe, and SAMe is needed for liver detoxification, and you need to support glutathione. But then there's glucuronidation, and then there's bile function, and then there's liver function and kidney function. And make sure you bring in some probiotics, but the right probiotics, and then use the right binders because the right mycotoxins need the right binders. And then, of course, you should decolonize, right? And you get to a point where you're like, okay, well, it looks like I need to get a PhD in mold-related illness because without my PhD, I won't know what the heck to do with all of this. And this is what I obsessively followed. And if you saw the supplement list that I was giving patients 4 years ago, where literally was like 15 to 20 supplements, and this was supporting this was supporting this, and this was supporting this, and 50% of my families, after me going back and looking, like, what happened to them? Oh yeah, there's no way we could have done that. That was way too hard, and frankly, there's no way he could take all those supplements. We quit. And frankly, the families that were brave enough to do my somersaults of detoxification, the kids still didn't get better. Some of them actually got worse. Why? For those of you that are not familiar with ISEAI, I love this organization. I respect the people that are there. And my friend Mark Su is the president, and some of the most brilliant environmental experts are part of ISEAI. They have incredible resources. And for those of you that need support for your families who are in mold-related contamination, they've got incredible inspectors. So check them out. But this was a chart that I used as my Bible for so long. And I would see the mycotoxins in my patients, and then I would run to this and say, okay, I should use activated charcoal and probably chlorella. Yeah, that's what I should use because of these things. And then I started realizing that it was not working. Things were not getting better. And I spent days, weeks studying these pathways and trying to see, like, what am I missing? Why are these kids not getting better? Maybe I need to support this pathway because I didn't do a good job. Maybe I used the wrong binder. Maybe I didn't use enough of the binder. Maybe I need to do more to support the gallbladder. Maybe I need to give more choline because I'm not detoxifying the cells. The more patients I treated, the more questions I had. Because binders definitely seem to help some kids. And there were some kids where I looked like a genius. I put the kid on cholestyramine. The mom messages me, oh my God, his attention problems are so much better. He's more clear-headed. It's amazing. And then there were a lot of families where, no, it's been 4 months, Dr. K. My kid is no better. And I kept staring like, why is it that a lot of these kids aren't getting better? Am I just not giving them enough binders? Should I give it 3 times a day? And then, the most troubling part of this was I'd have the kids on 6 months of binders and detox. And then I would recheck their urinary mycotoxins, and half of them were the same, and 25% of them actually got worse. And clinically, they were no better off than before the detox, to add to that. Well, you just didn't do enough of a detox, and they're just now finally clearing the toxins from their system. Again, this is not to question what's happening in adults, because I know a lot of adults have been helped by this. This is just in the kids. And then there were other things, like I would put kids on just a little, literally a smidge of choline, like a quarter of a 300, 500 milligram capsule, and they would get sick as hell. Like pants flares, autism flares, completely losing their mind. One little girl wouldn't wear any clothing for like a week. How the hell would a little smidge of choline cause a kid to fall apart? Well, you opened up their detox pathway, so now they're circulating more toxins, is what I believed and what I heard. And if it's the mycotoxins are floating through the system. They're the ones that are causing these kids to be sick. Then why is it that when you put them on 2 to 3 drops of a given herbal, some of these kids just completely implode, and they're more aggressive, they're more anxious, their attention goes down the tubes? Why would herbals cause a kid with mycotoxins to get sick? Makes no sense. And then you add to that, well, if you've treated enough kids with parasites, some kids, once you clear parasites, all of a sudden it's a miracle, right? PANS symptoms improve, autistic symptoms improve, attention focus problems improve, eczema improves. Parasites have to do with the gut. These mycotoxins are floating through the system. And then if you've done enough elimination diets, you find that food coloring and preservatives are like kryptonite, especially for these kids with PANS. So why would, if mycotoxins are causing some of these neurological issues, why would these food colorings and preservatives, well, they trigger neuroinflammation, and because they're causing neuroinflammation, they're making the symptoms worse. So that's what I believed. What if all of this is happening for different reasons, and what we understand about mold-related illness in kids is actually frankly incorrect? And then you layer on top of that certain things like Dr. Campbell's model, right? Binders are useless. He gets mad if you ask him if binders are helpful, and he's gotten mad at me a few times. Binders are useless. Itraconazole is what helps. Dr. Campbell, binders have helped. I don't know why, but they help. It's not because of the mycotoxins. Okay. And he's right. A lot of the mycotoxins we see in our urinary mycotoxins are actually from the diet. So if the mycotoxins that we're seeing are from the diet, then what the hell are we treating? Does itraconazole bind mycotoxins? Does itraconazole, like, how the hell does it work? And if you've ever had the pleasure of talking with Dr. Campbell, he says, well, mold doesn't really colonize. Well, Jesus, if mold doesn't colonize and mycotoxins we see in the urine are from the food, then what the hell is the itraconazole doing? Because it clearly makes a difference, and it's become one of my favorite treatments of all times. But why? And then you add to that studies like Dr. Baker's, and I've had many patients with PANS and PANDAS or autism improve. How the hell would an antifungal cause reversal of autism in 6 months? That's weird. What are we treating? What are we treating, and what are we missing? And if it's a colonization problem, colonization is what's causing toxicity, right? Because there's this thing of like, well, some people don't get better because they're colonized, and it's the fungi, molds in the gut that are releasing toxins. And because of that, they're staying toxic because of the toxins that these molds are releasing. It's an internal toxicity from the mold. Okay, let's look at that. Total microbiome of the microbiome, the total fungal makeup of the microbiome is 1%. Of all of the studies out there, you find that the Aspergillus, penicilliums, the toxin producing molds that have any fair chance of surviving our gastrointestinal tract make up less than 30%. Being generous, it's more like 10 to 20% of the total microbiome. So if you've got 0.2 to 3% of the total microbiome being these problematic molds, and let's say they do take a foothold in our gut, how the hell does 0.2% of our total microbiome be sufficient to cause toxicity? Are these molds like just becoming toxin producing factories, which they are? But is that enough to make us that sick? That doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. These are questions that we don't ask. I mean, frankly, like I don't see anyone asking these questions. And yet we just follow along and say, well, this is the concept and it's because of this and this is what I should do because this is what someone said. And we limit our ability to help these poor kids who are struggling because that's to me why we're here. This is what this conversation is about. Too many kids are struggling. Too many kids are failing out of school. Too many kids' lives are destroyed because of neuroinflammation. They can't regulate themselves. They can't learn. They can't function. That is why we need to be asking more questions. And then you run into these studies where they say, well, these molds, fungi, actually shouldn't colonize the healthy gut. So then the question becomes, well, shoot, if they don't normally colonize, then what the hell would cause them to colonize? And how does this all fit together in one model? Right? How do we bring this all together? How does this all click together? Occam's razor, right? If there's one answer that explains everything, then probably that answer is right. And in the next discussion, we're going to get into details of how all of this happens. And then add to that, if that wasn't enough, how the hell does the immune system influence toxicity? Like you've got these HLA haplotypes, right? And those of you that have been in the world of mold, you've probably done this on a few kids. And Dr. Shoemaker's observations that these HLA haplotypes can cause susceptibility to toxicity. And they may be one of the primary factors driving toxicity. How the hell does the immune system influence toxicity? Well, no, it's not really the toxicity. It's the inflammatory response in the SIRS. That's the issue. Okay, so then does that mean Dr. Nathan is wrong? Because he seems to be right, because talk binders do seem to help. So how does that all come together? How are all of these experts right at the same time? We don't ask enough questions. And for some of you who have treated enough patients, how does COVID come into the picture? How does RSV come into the picture? How do other bacteria and parasites come into the picture? And I've had several cases, kid had some mold, still okay, got COVID, woo, system went into a complete tailspin. Suddenly autistic features came out. Kid wasn't totally fine, had some sensory issues, had some learning problems, but was okay. Oh my God, after COVID, now actually has a diagnosis of autism. I've seen that with RSV. Kid went into full PANS flare after having RSV. How the hell would RSV cause toxicity or exacerbate mold toxicity? It makes no sense. We don't ask enough questions. So all of these questions are really to bring us to a place of really saying, God, maybe as it pertains to kids, actually, our understanding of mold-related illness is in need of an update. And what we thought we understood about these kids may not entirely be correct. So is there a better way for us to understand what is happening to these kids? And this is what I would propose, that we redefine mold toxicity as environmentally induced gut-mediated toxicity. I know it's a mouthful. Ultimately, the toxicity that we think is from the environment is not from the environment, it's from the gut. But what the environment does is derails the gastrointestinal tract and causes such massive dysfunction in the gastrointestinal tract that now we become toxic because of what is in the gut. And we become inflamed because of what happens in the gut. And I would really, really encourage all of you to spend quite a bit of time studying this diagram. At first glance, it looks really simple because you're like, oh, that's obvious. Yeah, yeah. The mechanisms behind this are anything but simple. And if you look at this and kind of memorize it at a very superficial level, guess what? You're going to get some kids better. And then you're going to say, well, God, why are these other kids not working? It's probably because the model isn't working. Each and every single parts of this diagram, you can literally spend weeks studying, and I have. I mean, this diagram came from probably 400 articles that I ultimately researched and studied and kind of filed in my brain to get to this place. And the most important piece of this diagram is this, and particularly this. And what I would propose is that the neuroinflammation that we see is related to this, and the toxicity that we say is mold toxicity is the endotoxemia. It's the bacterial endotoxins. And I propose that the reason why our model of mold-related toxicity is inaccurate is because it's not the mold toxins that keep us sick. It's not the mold toxins that impact the nervous system and cause the catastrophic changes that we call PANS and PANDAS, autism, learning disability, severe ADHD, etc. It's the bacterial endotoxins. And you'll see why. We're going to get into this in detail. And perhaps these endotoxins are absolutely the most sinister toxin of them all. They can cause gut permeability. They can cause gut inflammation. They can trigger systemic inflammation. They can trigger neuroinflammation. They can disrupt the blood-brain barrier. They can cause mitochondrial damage, and they all can come from the environment as well. And we're going to get into this in detail in a following presentations. I want you to take a moment to reflect on this study. This comes from the neurodegenerative world. And if you spend any time looking at what's there, the amount of research that's pouring out, and this is all new research, you can still, this is from 22. The amount of new research that's coming out it's like a floodgate that's opened. And what they're learning is these microbiome-derived toxins, these lipopolysaccharides, are the most potent pro-inflammatory neurotoxins known. I mean, I don't know how to make it any more apparent. And they can induce lethal neurodegenerative disorders. And I would argue that autism at its core is a neurodegenerative disorder. I would argue that PANS and PANDAS is a pro-inflammatory neurotoxic condition. And these bacterial endotoxins, when you get into the literature, it's scary what these things can do. It's terrifying what these things can do. One of the things that they can do is trigger a significant neuroinflammatory response. And you can see this is not from one article. You guys are welcome to pull these articles and look at them. These mycotoxins can cause neuroinflammation. The endotoxins cause sinister amounts of inflammation. Why is that important? Well, one, when you get microglial activation, when you get any kind of neuroinflammatory response, it's like they pull out their, walkie-talkies or whatever, like, hey buds, we got a problem. You all need to roll up in here. And now you get the mast cells that become activated in the nervous system. The astrocytes become activated in the nervous system. And there's two things in this diagram that I want you to pay attention to. First of all, everything triggers everything. Everything can activate everything. And these mast cells are very good at secreting histamine. But look at this TNF alpha. And there's a treatment that we're going to look at the very end that addresses this. Also pay attention to these little funny thingies that are over here. These are histamine receptors. When there's excess histamine, when there's a lot of inflammation, the entire nervous system immune response goes haywire. And when that happens, neuroplasticity, neural signaling, neural pathways. I mean, it's like you throw the brain into a blender and you hit pulsate. Pathways get disrupted in significant ways. You can argue that's what autism is. In less significant ways, these kids who present with weird learning disabilities, problems with executive functioning, they can't process, they can't think, they can't. If neural pathways are getting disrupted because of this neuroinflammatory response, and we're going to get into way more discussion of this, with this comes neurotoxicity. So you get neuronal apoptosis, the neuron cells die. You get mitochondrial changes, so neuronal signaling gets slowed down. So this conversation is really the tip of the iceberg of what can happen. But as we present and talk about this information, I want you to just stand back and say, what does this mean for my patients? Because these are studies that I haven't just randomly come across. All of the studies, everything that you're seeing are studies that I ultimately pulled because I saw things in my patients. And it was my patients that had me ask enough questions to say, wait, why is this happening? Why is this not working? Why are all these things not clicking? And what else can I do to better serve these kids? Microglial activation can cause a hell of a lot of neuronal irritation. It can trigger quinolinic acid, which is a nasty neurotoxin. It can change glutamate pathways, which causes a lot of neural excitability. So those kids who are highly irritable, they're agitated, they can't ever settle down. If your brain is on fire, how would you respond? And what I really wish you'll do is take a moment, and the next time you see a child who's just aggressive and irritable and everything triggers them, stand back and say, God, could this be neuroinflammation? I'm going to give you a really simple treatment to implement at the end to help these kids. Microglia disrupt oxytocin. Oxytocin is needed for sociability. And I mean, I couldn't find a more clear article. Microglia regulate this system. And the reason why I came to find this is as I downregulated the microglia through various treatments, I kept seeing these kids with autism suddenly becoming more sociable, and they're now wanting friends, and they're wanting play dates, and they're wanting to interact. Even some of the nonverbal autistic kids, it's the most beautiful thing. Like, they still can't talk, but now they want to go play. They literally like are seeking friends. They don't know how to socialize with them. They don't know how to articulate. They don't know what to say. They don't know what to do. But for the first time in their lives, they're actually seeking social contact. Why? Because oxytocin is firing in their brain. Why? That irritability, that agitation, their brain on fire has calmed down. And the treatments at the very end are all targeted at this. Microglial activation can disrupt the amygdala. The amygdala is our limbic system. The limbic system mediates our perception of fear. What do we see in a lot of these kids with autism, with PANS? Especially the kids with PANS, they're terrified of everything, right? They have these phobias. I need to wash my hands 15 times because otherwise I'm going to die. Oh my God, that bee is going to kill me. When the microglia are activated, the brain's perception of fear is completely off. And then when you ask psychologically, how is anger and aggression related to fear? What you find is fear is where aggression and anger come from. So on top of the brain on fire, agitation, quinolinic acid, glutamate, neuroexcitability, you have this completely distorted perception of fear. Why would we expect these kids to act any different? If you learn to pay really close attention to what's happening to these kids, you will see physiology unfolding before your eyes. And everything these kids do, you see that there's a reason of why they do it. Microglial activation has been tied to all kinds of mental health issues, particularly depression, attention deficit, and OCD. We'll touch on this later. When there's microglial activation, there's mast cell activation within the nervous system, which dumps out a whole lot of histamine within the nervous system. And you can see that this is all driven by this bacterial endotoxins. Why is that important? It turns out that histamine is what dominates our arousal systems. Those kids that wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and they can't go back to sleep, those kids that have a hard time falling asleep, the kids that wake up at the crack of dawn, even though they only had 6 hours of sleep and they're just wired. Think about the time that you took Benadryl, you gave Benadryl to a kid, and right? These kids have abnormal food intake. Why? Because histamine modulates appetite. And if you've got a nervous system that's buzzing at 1,000 miles an hour, why would you expect these kids to be the hungry bears that are eating everything? If that wasn't bad enough, you get changes in sensory pathways. Learning triggers anxiety, disrupts the sensory pathways in profound ways. Not to say that mold exposure and these bacterial endotoxins are the only thing, but at least in my book, the main reason why kids come to develop these sensory distortions is because of the endotoxins, which comes from the mold exposure. And what you'll see in these kids is they've got the phobias, they've got the sensory issues, they've got the sleep disturbance, they've got this, they're hyper irritable, they're hyper anxious, and they're constantly moving because of their vestibular. They're clumsy because they lack motor planning. A little touch causes them to completely flip. They can't wear clothing. They have trouble reading. They get overwhelmed by sound. These kids are telling us exactly what is going on with them. They're telling us exactly what is wrong. We have just failed to understand what's going on because we kept looking at this, I think, from the wrong angle. So ultimately, these kids that have the endotoxemia, they're aggressive, they're irritable, their appetites are off, their sleep is off, they're distractible, they're hyperactive because their vestibular pathways, their motion balance pathways are off. And we're going to get into all of this. They're shy because they're overwhelmed. Pay attention to this. And when you see this, ask yourself, could this be mold? This is a beautiful publication from Dr. Campbell. Now, Dr. Campbell's focus was mold toxicity, but what ultimately the study was talking about is children who have been exposed to mold, and I would argue children who now have endotoxemia present with this. They have issues with working memory. They can't learn math for the life of them. They're inattentive. They have poor executive functioning. They have various processing problems. Take time to study this because it's everywhere. And a lot of times we say, oh, this is ADHD. Except it's not, because the child also has difficulty learning math and they can't remember what they learned. And they have this issue and they have this processing problem. But we just slapped on that label and threw Ritalin. This is how toxicity looks in a mind of a child. So the question is, have we been treating endotoxemia all along, right? Because what's really fascinating is when you stand back and, early on, I'd seen this, endotoxins, LPS right there. Oh, shoot, activated charcoal. Oh, shoot, chlorella. Oh, cholestyramine. And then it turns out other things can do it as well. Huh. Have we been treating endotoxemia all along? Maybe we have. Because it turns out cholestyramine is one of the most potent binders of endotoxins. And now, in retrospect, I realize the reason why some of those kids got better, because I reduced their endotoxin load. But the reason why the mycotoxins were still floating around is because I wasn't treating the mycotoxins. I was treating the endotoxins, activated charcoal, bentonite clay, all bind endotoxins. Chlorella binds endotoxins. It prevents the translocation of these bacteria, which triggers inflammation. Have we been treating this model all along, except we didn't know? Probably. What about choline? Why did I make those kids really sick? Why did these kids not tolerate choline? Turns out you need fat to transfer these endotoxins from the gut into the circulation. And it turns out when you do a really good job mobilizing all those bile salts, guess what? You have now helped all of those endotoxins that were trying to get in. It's like you set up a transportation system and now you're just funneling these endotoxins into the system. Good job. If I wasn't asking enough questions in these kids, if I didn't notice these kids that I was making sick and I didn't say, why the hell am I making these kids sick? We wouldn't be here. We need to ask more questions. And when you really critically look at this, you're like, oh my God, maybe this is part of what's going on with these kids. Again, not to say choline doesn't help adults. They've got totally different physiologies. And then you ask, well, if colonization is not necessarily the main problem, then why the hell would itraconazole work? Until you do a search for azoles or itraconazole and inflammation, itraconazole and gut inflammation, itraconazole and systemic inflammation, or anti-inflammatory. And what you find is there's this growing body of literature that talks about how these azoles are powerful, not just tiny, they're powerful anti-inflammatories. They're powerful gut anti-inflammatories. And how I came to realize this, on top of talking to Dr. Nathan, he's like, yeah, Pageman, these azoles don't just behave like antifungals, there's something more. And then I noticed in many kids that I was treating, all of a sudden, within a week or two, the autistic child was way more calm. Autistic child was making eye contact. The kid with PANS and PANDAS suddenly was astronomically more calm. And then following all these kids, I took it myself. And literally a week later, it was the calmest I had ever felt in my life, more than when I was doing meditation pretty much every day for multiple weeks at a time. My anxiety was markedly better. My tendency to overthink and be OCD was markedly better, almost gone. And it was within a week. And that's when I said, like, there's no way this is just a treatment of colonization. This has to be doing more than just treating the colonization. You'll see why this is important. And then we get into the HLA haplotypes, where what we learn is these HLA haplotypes influence the gut immune response. They influence the microbiome, because it turns out that the gut immune response is where a lot of our dysbiosis comes from. We're going to talk about that. When there's gut inflammation, dysbiosis always follows. And when there is a resilient gut immune response that doesn't get hit with these mycotoxins, it doesn't get disrupted by all of these different things, the gut integrity holds. Toxicity doesn't happen. When there's vulnerability in the gut immune response, in COVID, mycotoxins, glyphosates, all of the above come together to derail that gut immune response and trigger gut inflammation. That triggers endotoxemia, which then triggers the toxicity, which then triggers the neuroinflammation, and that's when everything goes sideways. Oh, that's how these things come together. That's why all of these experts have been right. And this is a theory. By no means do I pretend to have figured this all out. By no means do I know for sure that all of this is true. But if you ask enough questions, what you also realize is that this also means that every other friggin' model of mold related toxicity is also a theory at best. And instead of saying, oh, this is mold medicine, it's like, no, this is the theory of mold medicine. This is a work in progress. And why I put that null hypothesis is null hypothesis is basically you presume something is false until you can no longer nullify it, in which case then you say, well, God, it's probably true. This model that I presented to you of gut-mediated inflammation from environmental toxicity, I've spent the last 2 years trying my best to poke holes in it. And the reason why I finally felt that I should present this to you is because the harder I try, the more solid this model becomes. And it's not to say this model is new. My friend Beth Lambert was talking about this over a decade ago. Dr. Pizzorno was talking about gut endotoxemia 10 years ago. These ideas are not new. What is new is this cohesive model that brings everything together in a way that makes sense. It brings forward specific mechanisms, which we will talk about in the next presentation, of how mast cells derail the gut and how they trigger other cascades and how that then triggers dysbiosis, which then triggers neuroinflammation. This cohesive model that's integrated everything into one piece and highlighted certain mechanisms that we can treat is what's new. But it's so much more than mold. Because when we talk about environmental contamination, everyone thinks, oh, it's one toxin that I see in the urine. That's so far from the truth. When there's contamination, it's like someone, sending out a flyer like, hey, I'm having a block party. Anyone and their mother who wants to show up, please come. There's multiple molds, there's bacteria. The bacteria start producing their own volatile compounds. They release the bacterial endotoxins, and there are particulates that are inflammatory. And this combination, this toxic soup that is constantly being released into the environment, is what can make us sick in very small amounts. And I would argue it's this soup that is what is sufficient to cause kids to get sick. And we'll talk about how inhalation of these toxins impacts the gut in the next presentation. And at times it's not even mold, it's just the bacterial endotoxins. I've had families where move into a God knows how expensive mansion in the middle of the Palisades, and the genius that built it put an open septic tank in the basement. And there are some people that are living in the Midwest and other regions that have basements, and you've got sump pumps, and those sump pumps become moldy. And that mold or bacteria start releasing toxins. I have that family that moved into that mansion where that genius put in, it was an actual septic tank because toilets were draining to it. Disgusting, I know. Happened to be right next to the kids' play area. And the mom kept saying, something smelled so wrong about that basement. It smelled gross, and I couldn't understand why. And her 2.5-year-old, they moved from Florida into this home, and within a month, this 2.5-year-old that was doing well was suddenly autistic. I have had other families where, in one case, it turns out that the sewage ventilation pipes were broken, and it was actually outgassing right into the wall next to the kid's bed. That kid was presenting with PANS, learning disability, extreme fatigue, vomiting, waking up just vomiting for no reason. Bacterial endotoxins. And when you bring it all together, you see air pollution, COVID, plastics, glyphosates can all cause a mess. And that's why these pieces become the most important piece, because it's not about the toxin. It's about what happens to the body when that toxin becomes severe enough to cause dysfunction within the gut. This is just a conversation around total toxin load. The most important thing is when all of this is happening. How common is this? 1 in 2 to 1 in 10 kids are exposed. And this is according to the US EPA. So, for those of you that have not found a whole bunch of mold related illness in your practice, I would argue the reason why is you haven't known how to find it. When you start looking for it and when you learn how to find it, it will become terrifying. The frequency of it is terrifying. 1 in 10 to 1 in 2 kids are exposed. And chances are some of the most sickly kids that you see, the worst cases of autism, the worst cases of PANS, those kids with learning disabilities and ADHD that just don't get better, I would argue that quite a few of them, if not a large majority of them, have this at the root cause. Sadly, pretty much any part of the country is now prone to flooding. California, parts of the desert, and then those poor people in the South, my goodness. Most of these families don't have flood insurance. Most of them don't have the resources to completely renovate. So if they get any money, it's not a whole lot. So they kind of do what they can to patch their home together and they move on. This study right here, what they also found in New Orleans when it flooded was within a short period of time, within 5 years, the rates of autism tripled. The rates of autism tripled after New Orleans flooded. Now, they attributed that to, well, the families were under so much stress, and psychological stress has been tied to autism, which it has. But guess what? These folks in New Orleans were also exposed to gobs and gobs and gobs of mold because those folks did not have the resources or ability or perhaps awareness to even think about mold, right? You paint over it, you kind of clean it up, you do what you can and you move on with your life until your kid starts falling apart and you don't know why. The greatest fear that I have is with all this climate change and all this flooding, the rates of autism that have already gone up will now fly through the roof. And we will have clusters of autism in regions that we won't know why. We'll have kids with learning disabilities in higher prevalences than we've ever seen, and we won't know why. And we'll be missing it left and right. That is why this conversation is so important. How does it happen? Super easy. The geniuses that created drywall, they did something really impressively smart. They embedded the paper around the drywall with mold spores. The paper on drywall is not sterile. It comes from tree bark. It comes from recycled paper. Guess what's in that paper? Mold spores. Stachybotrys, Aspergillus, Penicillium, all of the toxin-producing molds are literally sitting there embedded in the drywall. So it's like the chia pet. You add some water, voila, there is mold. It's terrifying when you think about this. And you see over there, mold has become significantly higher concentrations with newer builds because of that. And it's not just in the drywall, it could be in the carpet. I've seen it where somewhere flooded, there was all of the underlayment of the carpet got wet long enough, there was mold. It could be in the basement, it could be in the attic, it could be in the HVAC. And then you add to that, what have we done with energy efficiency? We've sealed homes. We've sealed the windows. We've sealed the attics. We've prevented a whole lot of air loss. Why? For energy efficiency, which means we've created these toxic encapsulated environments that never breathe. So those toxins keep building up in the environment, causing more issue. And then it's in the food. It's in the grains that the animals eat. It's in the dairy. And one of the things that I believe is why gluten-free, dairy-free diets work in addition to reducing the immunological burden is you're actually reducing the toxic load. But here's the part that's really scary. Mycotoxins can concentrate it in milk. It concentrates in breast milk. So for all these families who are living in mold, the baby is exposed to the toxins before they ever make it out because it passes through the placenta. Mom does what she thinks is best and she starts breastfeeding this baby because breastfeeding is best. Except mom's toxic burden is through the roof because every time she inhales that air from that house, those toxins are entering her bloodstream and they're concentrating and getting passed on to the baby. The baby whose microbiome is just starting to form, the baby whose immune system is just starting to form. And then if mom's gut takes a bad enough hit, she doesn't just have mycotoxins floating through her system. She also has the bacterial endotoxins floating through the system. Now, exactly how these toxins get through the breast milk, I don't know. But it becomes a terrifying picture. And when you think about these kids who were diagnosed with regressive autism at a year, at 18 months, or somewhere in between, if you really, really, really carefully pay attention to their history, you'll see that none of those kids were normal. Meaning, a bunch of them had colic early on, but colic is normal, right? A kid screaming their head off for 2 or 3 hours a day, normal. A baby developing eczema by 6 months, normal. Kid having constipation or diarrhea, normal. Kids still having trouble sleeping by the time they're 6 months of age and they're just cracked out awake for hours at a time, normal. These are all early signs of mold exposure. They're early signs of microglial and mast cell activation. They're early signs of gut permeability problems. They're early signs of gut inflammation, except we don't know how to see it. So what happens? Kid is limping along. Their physiology is barely working, but it's keeping it together. They're still making eye contact. They're still babbling. Then comes along a vaccine, COVID, RSV, an antibiotic, parasite, whatever. And their system goes into a tailspin. And next thing the parent knows, the eye contact is gone. Next thing they know, that child is no longer talking. Why? Because now neuroplasticity is gone. Neurotoxicity is there. And that causes that child to fall apart. Now, we're so keen on focusing on what? The vaccine. Not to discount the vaccine. It's not to say the vaccines are not a problem and they don't cause harm in some kids. Why is it that so many kids get so many vaccines and they're absolutely fine and only a handful fall apart? Why is it that some kids get COVID and they're sick, but they don't turn into having autism or PANS? And then you expand this out, and then you see that some kids were fine. They're fine. And then at 2 or 3 years of age, they fall apart. And then you kind of look at it, oh, some of these families moved. So you start seeing how this picture comes together. And then when you look at that in terms of how this fits into the picture of these kids, and when their immune systems are priming, when their immune systems are coming together, when their microbiome is coming together, how capable is their liver? You reach this terrifying place where you start realizing that, my God, these poor little people, when they're exposed long enough, they get run over. And their systems fall apart and their guts can no longer handle that load and the guts fall apart and their microbiome never had a chance to normalize. And that combination is what throws them into a tailspin that they cannot come out until we intervene. And that is why this conversation is so important. And again, as you integrate all of this information, and I would encourage you to go back and look at all of these different things that I shared with you and just sit there and think about it. And as you keep plugging it into this cycle, this model, you'll see how all the pieces fit together and how this outcome is really a huge part of what we see with pediatric mental health. Give me 1 second here. So I want to shift and just do a high overview of the environmental testing. And really, this is all to have you walk away from this presentation with a handful of tools that you can start using tomorrow in your patients. So what about environmental toxicity? If you haven't asked enough mold patients, you're going to get this almost all the time. Oh, we tested our house. We don't have mold. We tested our house twice. We don't have mold. I can't tell you how many times families have told me that. And almost always, I'd say 95% of the time, what they were told was completely erroneous. And some well-intending, or maybe not, some charlatan came along. That person did a weekend course. They have no idea about any kind of environmental medicine. They did a half-assed job of assessing the home. Oh, you don't have mold, and with very clear, voice, you don't have mold, you're fine. And they walk away. And what's worse is, especially if someone's renting a home and they ask their landlord to hire a mold inspector, guess what? Oftentimes these landlords have found inspectors that intentionally do a very mediocre job, because if their inspector finds mold, guess what? That landlord now needs to fix it. And a lot of landlords, especially those that have been around the block a few times, they have multiple properties, they've wisened up to find that person that essentially does a half-assed job intentionally, because now they're off the hook. Oh no, we don't have mold. There's nothing there. You're imagining this. A lot of these people will come and they have these, infrared cameras. They'll scan the environment. Oh, there's no moisture problem. You don't have mold. Except, especially when you live in, arid environments like California, Arizona, or even, other parts of the country where it's not raining all the time, and you have a roof leak, you have a window leak. After a month, would you expect a moisture problem to be there? No. Except what we see from this dissertation, and if any of you are interested, you can pull this up. So Bloom actually did a doctoral thesis on mold toxicity. It's a fascinating beast of a dissertation to read. But one of the things that she talks about is how these mold spores and their fragments actually start aerosolizing in higher amounts when the environment starts drawing out. So this thing of, oh, you don't have a moisture problem, therefore you don't have mold, is obscene. And then you take it a step further. A lot of these mold inspectors, 99% of them, except for the rare few that are really working hard to find the mold, they have these air traps. And basically these are little vacuums with a little filter paper. And what these air traps do is basically they vacuum up air, a lot of air, for a period of, I don't know, several minutes. And what they're doing is they're sampling if the air to see if there's any mold spores in the air. So what they'll come into a house, let's say 1,500 or 2,000 square feet. They'll put one or two of these mold traps within the home. Like, this is a perfect example. Huge living room, one mold trap in the middle of the room. They take one sample and then they say, well, your garden has more mold than the inside of your house, and therefore you don't have mold. Except if you go and find the literature that talks about how far mold spores can travel, and I did that, because the question is, well, okay, if this thing is 10 or 15 feet away from that kitchen, and that kitchen is where the mold problem is, how far would these mold spores travel to get into that mold trap to then show a positive result? 1 to 4 inches. 1 to 4 inches is how far these mold spores can travel. And unless someone is intentionally stirring up the air, which none of these inspectors do, you can see how ridiculous it is to take one sample and say you don't have a mold problem. The best part of it is they look at the total amount of mold. So this is from one of my families. And you can see they said normal, normal, these are controls. And this area was the kitchen area was normal because the total amount of mold was less than the total amount of the highest sampling they took, and therefore there's no mold. Except if you look at these, and if any of you have had families where you suspected mold and the family said, oh, we don't have mold, we tested our home, ask them to send you the actual report, especially of the testing. It'll be a fun exercise for you to do. And it's really simple. You go and you look at the actual Penicillium and Aspergillus, and most of these companies only look for this, and Penicillium and Aspergillus then becomes the only potentially toxin producing mold. And you say, well, is this count higher than this or not? And what you find is like, oh crap, in this case, the kitchen had what, 3 times the level of the outside control and 10 times the level of this control. And then chetomium, which is a very ugly black toxic mold, actually didn't exist in the environment. And there it is in the kitchen. So this is not to turn you into an overnight mold inspector by any means. I actually, my intention is not to make you PhDs in environmental medicine. That's where ISEI comes in. Those guys do this for a living. What I do want you to do is have the awareness. So next time someone says, oh, we tested our house, we don't have mold, you instantly think, well, actually, we have no idea if you do or don't. So maybe if I'm suspicious, hey, do you mind checking your home? I've seen families come into a brand new construction, literally, the house is a year old. And I told them, like, hey, you may have mold. Oh, no, you're absolutely insane. Our house is a brand new custom instruction. There's no way we can have mold. And it turns out that the genius that connected the air conditioning unit drain line right here screwed it up. So every time that air conditioner was running, literally there's just a swamp of water sitting there, not draining. And therefore, the air conditioning had become the source of mold. And every time they were running that air conditioning, it was pumping out toxins into the environment, making the child sick. And I've seen this a bunch of times. It could be, I've had families where their house is fancy enough where they've got this gorgeous wine cellar, and behind the wine cellar or behind the custom built fridge was the source of mold. And at the end of the day, it could be anywhere. What I do want you guys to get familiar with are these ERMIs. These are basically DNA probes of the environment. So one of the things that I want you guys to start doing, and we're going to touch on this at the end, is when you start questioning, like, could this be mold? What I want you to do is say, hey, there's a chance you could have mold. We don't know. Would you be willing to spend $250 to just do a dust test of your home? Let's see. These tests won't lie. You know, it's either there's something there or not, and we'll have some information. And usually families are like, okay, $250, we can swing that. And basically what we're doing is we're getting a sampling of the dust within the home and looking to see if there's weird fragments of molds that don't belong there. The one caveat with this is to tell the families not to dust or clean the home for at least 10 to 14 days, because if they've just cleaned the home and you've sampled the dust, there's no dust, nothing will show up. And ultimately, we get these reports, and we're going to touch on this in much more detail in the environmental piece. And what we will see are basically breakouts of the different types of mold. And again, we're going to touch on this. The one company that I think is worth you guys using, at least at this early stage, is called the dust test. And some of the environmental people have a qualm with the dust test. The reason why I like them is they make it obscenely easy for you to do the test, or for families to do the test. They send them instructions on how to do it, where to sample, where not to sample, so you don't have to play environmental expert. And they give this very easy to understand scale. One through 3 is basically the house is great. Level 4, maybe there's a problem, because you can see it goes from the 50th to the 90th percentile, which is a huge range, right? And I've talked to them like, hey guys, can you break it down? Haven't seen that happen yet. So code 4 is still like, maybe there's a problem, maybe not. And then there's code 5, which is, the top percentile that you do not want to be in, which is then the percentile that says like, there is a probability. And this is where you guys are not the environmental experts. You don't say, oh, for sure you have mold. This is not like, oh, I knew it. This is like, you know what? This looks like it's suggesting there's some kind of issue. Maybe we should look into it further. And the folks at the dust test have follow-up appointments. Well, I'll share some additional resources on the forums in terms of where to go, and it'll also be on the new area where we're going to share all of these videos. But one of the things that I want you to do is to start recommending this to a handful of your patients where you suspect this. And I want you to start seeing how often this test comes up positive if you haven't already been using these Hermes. You will be surprised by the number of times you're like, I'm not sure if this is mold. It kind of looks like it, but the family told me there is no mold. And we're going to touch on the diagnostic testing. And the diagnostic tests are not the case, but oh my God, this is highly positive. Talking about diagnostic testing, would you say that this is a child that's horrifically exposed to mold? This was one of my first patients where I looked at this. I'm like, oh, this isn't too bad. And so Dr. Nathan is like, oh, for sure, this is mold. And then we retested him a year later. They had already moved out of the home. I hadn't done a single thing. And you can see his levels just went through the roof. All of a sudden, the normal looking mycotoxin tests became very, very abnormal. Would you say this is a kid that's been exposed to mold? Doesn't look terrible, right? There's that gliotoxin, everything else not present. It's not there, right? This can't be mold. This kid can't be exposed to mold. The urine doesn't look it. Except you test this kid 6 months later, again, didn't do a darn thing. In fact, they were actually still living in the environment. And now all of a sudden, all of these markers are positive. For those of you that use organic acids, does this look like a kid who's highly toxic? No. And how many of you have used this very test as your only screening tool and looked at it and say, oh, yeah, all of these fungal markers look okay. This can't be mold, and you move on. I've done that early on when I started training with Dr. Nathan. I was doing this all the time, and it was Dr. Nathan's like, hey, Pejman, maybe you shouldn't use those organic acids as your sole tool of diagnosing. And in this case, this was the little one a year later, still living in the same home. Mom didn't believe me. So I was like, hey, why don't we just repeat it, see what happens? And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, fill in the blank. This is really not good, is it? Why I share these with you is I believe we spend way too little time talking about the gross inadequacies in our diagnostic tools. You get way many more lectures on how awesome these diagnostic tools are, right? Oh, these are the best tools. And depending on which forum you belong to and who you're following and who you're talking to and which presentation you heard, and half of them are sponsored, right? You get all of these positives of why these diagnostic tools are so great. Sadly, I don't think we talk enough about all of the times that the diagnostic tools fail and how often they can mislead you. And until essentially you get to I hate to say borderline paranoid place where mold is always in the back of your mind and your clinical suspicion is what drives you, even when you get a test. And I recently had a patient, PANS, high inflammation, high anxiety, just couldn't regulate for the life of him, trouble going to school. All my tests, including some of the things that I'll show you, all of them came back normal. Mom did that the dust test, horrific amounts of contamination. So you have to understand that all your diagnostic tools can fail you. And you have to understand their limitations to be able to understand how to help these kids. And these are all things we're going to talk about in detail in the follow-up presentation. So by no means is this one talk meant to give you full orientation to everything. It's to get you to be thinking about these things. We don't discuss the other issues with some of these tests. So to Dr. Campbell's point, it turns out that mycotoxins can come from the diet, what's in the urine. And in this one case, this was of a mom. She did this test and she started freaking out. She's like, "Oh my God, I'm going to die. I'm so toxic. I'm going to fall apart." I'm like, you know what? This may be your diet. Can you just get rid of corn and peanuts and gluten and dairy and dried fruits for a month? Let's repeat it. This is what it looked like after. And how you know if it's food related is if you see a big spike in ochratoxin and gliotoxin disproportionate to everything else, that should be a big red flag to you that this is food related. This was another family, same thing. Like, oh my God, I'm going to die. I'm so toxic. This is the end of the world. And you can see the values dropped by what? Fivefold, threefold? Because of these things, frankly speaking, I've stopped using urinary mycotoxins altogether. And I've started using other ways of assessing toxicity. And this is the study again that talks about the strong association with urinary mycotoxins and ingestion of these foods. And again, we're going to talk about this more in the diagnostic. It's not just that. It's not just the diet. Depending on your liver and organs of detoxification, you can get completely different patterns of detoxification, where in this case, husband and wife, same house, same diet, everything pretty much the same. You can see like one of them is noticeably different than the other. This is a mom and child. Child, same environment. They're actually kind of eating the same foods. Kid doesn't look terrible. Mom, oh my God. Oh yeah, that's not good. If you're not aware of this and you blindly order this test on a kid, and then you blindly follow those results and say, oh, urinary mycotoxins are normal, therefore this kid isn't exposed to mold, and the family told me that they tested their house and they don't have mold, therefore this is a mold, and you go off treating a million other things, you miss the elephant in the room. False negatives are extremely high with these organic acids. For those of you that use stool testing, I mean, you might as well just not even bother looking for the mold because it won't even show up on any of the stool tests, whether it's Tiny Health, the fancy, DNA probes. Stool testing completely misses it altogether. If you're doing conventional labs, unless again you've got a paranoia and you're starting to look for subtle things, and we're going to talk about all of this in much more detail, you'll miss it. Now, one of the things that I want you to start getting familiar with, for those of you that can order blood testing, are these antibodies. So there was a 2003 study where Dr. Campbell and Vojdani did this study, and they looked for antibodies against molds and mold toxins in individuals that had been impacted by water damaged buildings. And what they found was significantly higher levels, and you can pull this study and look at it, significantly higher levels in those who were exposed versus those that were not. Now, and again, we're going to talk about all of this in much greater detail, but there's a reason why I'm sharing this with you. Not everyone agrees with this. Some people think that the study was flawed. And again, it's not a well-accepted norm. What I can tell you is that in the kids, these antibodies are highly effective in picking up mold exposure. The problem is some issues with this, where, for instance, if you use my Microlab, it turns out that the same year that they did this paper, they filed for a patent, and Dr. Campbell and Vojdani are friends, and Dr. Campbell runs my myco lab. Does this mean this is all a hoax? I don't think so. I think that this technology is still fabulous to use, but the reason why I'm sharing this with you, and we'll touch on this in greater detail, is for you to be aware of these things. So if you blindly order the test and someone comes along and says, well, I don't believe it for whatever reason, it's because of this. It turns out that fortunately, my myco lab is not the only show in town. I love my myco lab. And for those families that can afford $400, and especially if you've got an older kid, I think it's a fantastic test. And what my myco lab is looking for are immune reactions against the actual toxins, the mold toxins, which gives you a very clear idea of if there's actually been exposure to various mold toxins. The company that, frankly, I use regularly is Alitas, and you can order it on Rupa Health. It's about $200 instead of $400. What they're looking for are antibodies against the molds themselves. Beyond the cost savings, what I sometimes find is the kids are immunologically more reactive to the mold spores than the mold toxins. So you can argue that the sensitivity of Allotest is actually a little better than my mycolab in little kids. Some people have used LabCorp. LabCorp does have a mold IgG panel. I haven't used it just because I've really come to trust Allotest. If you run into families who are really restrained on money, you can actually just order the individual antibodies, and we'll talk about that in greater detail. But this is something that I want you to pay attention to. And one of the things that I want you to start doing, in addition to ordering the dust test, is to start ordering mold antibodies on some of the kids that you have been caring for, to start seeing how often and how common these exposures are. I'm going to skip this. And this is how my myco lab looks. So this was one child where kind of things started adding up. The mold antibodies were positive, and then you can see the mycotoxin antibodies were positive. This is a kid where organic acids look completely normal. Again, we're going to do a deep dive on this in the follow-up presentation. Look totally normal. Things were anything but normal immunologically. And it turns out that this child was exposed to scary amounts of mold, like their house needed to be condemned kind of mold. Not always are these antibodies positive. I'd say 20% of the times I'll get a false negative. And why I'm saying this is whenever possible, I try to order the antibodies with either a urine mycotoxin or now more often a urine organic acid, because that combination eliminates or reduces the possibility of getting two false negatives at the same time. This is where we are. This is where we are with our diagnostic testing. And one way that I would like to propose for you to start working up some of your patients is if a family says, look, there's no way in hell we're going to draw blood on my kid, try to get an organic acid through Genova or Mosaic, but also do a urinary mycotoxin. The likelihood of both of those missing it is less. If you can draw blood, I think doing some kind of antibody test plus or minus an organic acid is the best way to go. If the family has no money, again, that's where you may want to start using LabCorp. And we'll touch on these oxalates a little later. But I want you to start getting familiar with this. And not that you're going to be an expert overnight, but I want you even now to start ordering these tests, even if you don't know what the heck you're going to do with them. How does mold exposure or this gut-mediated toxicity look? PANS, I'd say over 50% of the kids that I take care of who have neuroinflammation and they have the diagnosis of PANS and PANDAS have mold-related toxicity. Kids with severe eczema, allergies. In my book, mold, environmental mold is the only thing that presents with severe allergies, severe asthma, eczema, hives, food allergies. If you see that picture, you need to be highly worried, borderline paranoid that the child has been exposed to mold, whether it was in a prior home or in a current home. Memory issues, attention problems, ADHD, joint pains. Now, joint pains can also show up with Lyme, but growing pains, a lot of these kids get bone pain, which is more related to this, and various gastrointestinal issues. What is oftentimes helpful is to ask the parents, and I highlighted the two top things over there. Hey, mom and dad, do either of you have any brain fog or any energy issues where you're just tired all the time? Start asking that of all of the families where you suspect there's the possibility of mold. And what I'm willing to bet you is 80 to 90% of the time, one of the parents are going to be like, yeah, that's me. My brain stopped working a few years ago. Yeah, I used to have photographic memory and I can't remember a darn thing anymore. Yeah, I'm just tired all the time and I have to drink like 5 cups of coffee just to get going. I don't understand, why am I so tired? That's mold-related toxicity, except it's showing up in a healthy, resilient adult who hasn't gone fully toxic. We're going to touch on these things later on. You can get disruptions in all kinds of different areas, from cerebral folate deficiency, adrenal imbalances, mitochondrial issues, et cetera, et cetera. So what do I want you to do? First thing, again, I want you all to start testing these kids for exposure. And I want you to start filtering these labs starting now for this. And if you can order, especially blood testing, I would say go for ALLOTest. If the family has more money, go for my Micro lab. But start doing these tests, even if you do them just in a handful of kids. I want you to dip your foot in the water and start looking for how prevalent this is. I want you to start testing the kid's environment. Even if you can't do the diagnostic testing, at least 5 of your families, just say, hey, can you do this dust test? And please make sure for 10 to 14 days before, don't have anyone clean the environment, don't have anyone spray anything in the environment. Let that dust settle, because we're testing the dust and we want a lot of dust in your environment. See how many times that dust test comes back abnormal, and how many of your existing patients that you may have suspected they had mold, but because of X, Y, or Z reasons, you ultimately ruled that out. Go back and revisit these cases and just look. We're going to get into a lot of the treatment approaches, but what I want us to start doing is identifying the exposure, and I'll give you guys tools and all how to also control this. And we're going to start working on this second piece. And the final treatment model will get into a lot of this and more. How are we going to do that? Really simple. I want you to stop, in the kids that you're suspecting this is going on, I want you to stop all the supplements. Kids who are highly toxic are highly reactive, and their gastrointestinal immune responses are highly illogical. So fish oils, the citric acid in the multivitamins, whatever other compounds, choline, other fats, any and all of these things could be triggering their issues. So to get a very clean slate, just literally for 1 month, I want you to tell the family to stop all the supplements, put them on some vitamin D with K, put them on some zinc. Ideally, a zinc that comes in a liquid form, so it doesn't have the citric acid. The Mercola liquid zinc, which is dirt cheap, it's like $18 to $20 a bottle. You can buy it pretty much anywhere. That's a pretty decent one. It comes in apple juice. Kids like it. Pure Formulas has a pretty decent zinc. That's a liquid. But avoid citric acid like the plague. This is what I also want you to do. And I want you to take this combination and apply it in at least 10 to 20 kids. Kids that have pans and pandas, kids with autism, kids with learning disabilities, kids who are just easily irritable and just dysregulated. Why are we doing this? This becomes our poor man's way of asking if that loop the loop cycle is at play. Because essentially what we're doing is through this combination, we're reducing the mast cell activity within the gut. We're reducing the histamine within the gut. We're reducing the histamine within the nervous system. We're reducing microglial activation within the nervous system. And if you need to, and I would say you do this a week or two later, you add some cat's claw because cat's claw happens to be fantastic at reducing TNF alpha. And if you go back to that diagram with TNF alpha pointing away from the microglia to the mast cells and the astrocytes, essentially what cat's claw can do is further reduce the immune activation. If you do this enough, and the dosing is right here, what you will find is, especially if you just use these two, minus a rare number of kids, and I peg them at 5, maximum 10%, you will find at least 50+% of these kids to improve in their symptoms by 20 to 30%. The autistic kids who are highly irritable, who are overwhelmed in their environment, suddenly over a month, are less irritable. They're less reactive. They're making more eye contact. They're starting to eat 2 new foods that they never ate before. The kids with pans and pandas that are completely having anger episodes, panic attacks, phobias, are still irritable, anxious, scared, but no longer having panic attacks. And what this does is essentially it becomes a poor man's way of saying, is this microglial activation? Is this mast cell driven inflammatory response? Is this gut mediated toxicity a problem? And if the child improves by, again, 20 to 30%, we're not expecting a miracle, over the course of 3 or 4 weeks, that actually says, yes, these physiological processes are at play. And one, you look so smart in front of your families, right? But it also then tells you, like, gosh, this is going on. Now, what you will find is there will be some kids that improve by 50 or 70%, where 1 or 2 of the families may be like, oh my God, this is the most amazing thing that's ever happened to us. In that case, what you also learn is this child probably had past exposure. The likelihood of ugly amounts of exposure are currently at play is less. This child's gastrointestinal tract is probably not a complete train wreck, because if there was tons of endotoxins, tons of inflammation, you get the other scenario where you give the supplements and either nothing happens and the kid is just as irritable and angry and aggressive as before, or you get this 5% reactivity where that child's immune system is so unhinged that they're now reacting to even these anti-inflammatories, which then takes you back to the drawing board. And the first question you need to ask is there some kind of horrific exposure in this child's environment? And it could be at school, it could be in other environments, but is there some kind of horrific exposure that we're missing? Is this even Lyme-related illness? Is this even mold-related illness? Could this be Lyme disease? Could this be some kind of other toxin? I've had glyphosates be the primary toxin, and these treatments don't seem to work as well for that. But I want you to start testing this out in a fair number of your patients, ideally at least 10 to 20. And I want you to start doing this now. So as we start proceeding into the next layers of this discussion over the next month or two, you start getting some feedback from your patients. And that gives you some experience for us to then build on as we move down the discussions. I want you guys to become active past sitting there and listening to one lecture and not utilizing these tools, not thinking about it, not asking questions, not actively engaging. I hate to say this, you're going to get a few little tidbits. You're going to try this. Half the time it's going to work, half the time it's not. You may give up and move on. I'm intentionally presenting extremely complex material in a simplified way so that you can grasp this information and within the short period of time we have together be able to use this information. By no means is this information simple. And the more you exercise these concepts, the more you use them, the more you think about them, the more you talk about them, the more questions you ask, the more familiar you get around this entire model, and then how you're able to utilize the more advanced tools to actually shore up the gut and address the dysbiosis and so forth will make a lot more sense. So with that, I thank you guys for being here and being a part of this discussion. I know that there were a lot of comments. I'm first going to stop that. And while I'm looking at the questions, I want to see if any of you have any questions. All right, so let's look at. So it looks like mast cell histamine trial. It is. And what does the cat's claw do? So the cat's claw is ultimately more of a TNF alpha, I believe. I don't want to say inhibitor, but it creates a reduction of that. And if you look at the signaling cascades between that cell, so if you go to that kind of triangular diagram and you look at it, cat's claw essentially stops the microglia from hyperactivating the other immune cells. And then if you look at them, they can come back and activate the microglia. So we start breaking and reducing all of these cycles of chronic activation. All right. Do they hold everything for 1 month and the supplement? So what I would do is, if I understand the question correctly, so what I would do is start with the Mirica and histamine digester block together. For any of you that have families who are vegan, there's a product called NatureDAO. You can actually get that from Spain. So there's a website called Naturistas. So if you type in NatureDAO, it'll come up. It takes a week or two to get it. It's actually less expensive than the stuff in the US, but it's a fabulous product. So add those two, give them a week or two. If after a week or two, you're finding that it's not working, then add the cat's claw. The problem with cat's claw is 20 or 30% of the time it can actually trigger an immune response itself. So sometimes it works like gangbusters, and families are like, oh my God, this is the best thing that's ever happened to us ever. Warn them that there's a 20% chance that the kid is going to not do well. And if they see that, then they stop it. Emily, you had a question.
I just wanted to ask, a lot of my clients actually have IgG subclass deficiencies. And then when I run like full T and B cells, a lot of my clients have immune deficiencies. When they have immune deficiencies, is there impairment in the ability to create antibodies against mold toxins?
Really great question. What I have seen is no, because one, we're checking for not just IgG subclasses. A lot of times when you look, it's actually, it could show up in other ways. And generally speaking, one, I've found that the IgG immunodeficiency, I check a lot of the kids, are not as common as we think. They're definitely there. And if it's just a deficiency in one subclass, but the total IgG response seems to be robust enough, generally speaking, the kids will pop up positive. But to your point, again, 10 to 20% of the time, the kids will show false negatives. And I think those are the times where the amount of immunodeficiency is pretty significant. As an extension of this, what I'm starting to really be worried about is a abnormal immune response within the gastrointestinal tract. And what I'm finding in a lot of these kids, when we're checking immune reactions against the lipopolysaccharides, the occludins, zonulinolene proteins, whether it's Cyrex or Precision Diagnostics or KBMO, these are the companies that I've been using. I keep finding all of these kids are showing false negatives to these gut mediated reactions. So if we were to say diagnostically, when it comes to assessing mold exposure, yes, it can be a problem. It shows up, in my experience, 10 to 20% of the time. When it comes to asking other questions like, how is this impacting the gut? And is there a way to look at it? I think this very conversation is far more prevalent in how these things are showing up in the gut and how these are related and ultimately are these IgG subclass deficiencies, genetic? Is there something to do with these toxins? And we're going to touch on this because a lot of these mycotoxins can actually cause disruptions in immunoglobulin production, and they cause disruptions in, for instance, the T cells and their behavior. So how all of this ultimately impacts these weird patterns of immunodeficiency that we see, I don't know. But what we are going to talk about is what these mycotoxins do in the physiology and perhaps how that is explaining some of the things that we see. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, it just leaves a lot more thoughts for me. And I'm not a pediatrician. Most of my clients are adults, but a lot of the moms will ask me to treat kids, which is part of why I'm taking this series. So thank you for offering it. But this makes me think about anti-Saccharomyces antibodies, and I see that a lot in inflammatory bowel disease. And I've tried to give those patients Saccharomyces boulardii, and they react very badly. And it's very interesting to see that. The other thing I've seen, and I know you mostly spoke about itraconazole, I've had inflammatory bowel patients do extremely well with voriconazole when itraconazole didn't work. And I talked to Dr. Nathan about it, and he was like, whoa, that's a big gun. That's crazyville. But the patient got better, like significantly better. So, it's interesting to think about the immune mediation that goes on with all these azole medications.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's like that's the part that's so cool about this. Like it's absolutely fascinating. And if you take that very same model of inflammatory bowel disease and you look at like how that one fits into the next discussion we have, and then you ask, well, how does this very thing fit into the model of pediatric mental health and PANS and PANDAS and autism? The amount of overlap that you're going to see is insane. Now, fortunately, what I have found is with most of these kids, they do actually respond really well to easy things. Like, at 30% of the time with just nystatin, like compounded nystatin, these kids start getting better. That's the next layer of discussion for us to have a little bit later, but I'm really happy that you're here and start looking at how so many of these pieces come together as we continue the discussion. So worsening reactivity to treatment signifies worse endotoxemia exposure, etc. No, so it's not just the endotoxemia. When I see reactivity, part of what I see is a gastrointestinal tract and systemic immune response that's basically gone completely upside down. Now, with that, almost always comes endotoxemia, because when the gastrointestinal tract is sufficiently disrupted to the point where the immune system has become completely dysregulated. To think about, what does it take for an immune system to be so highly reactive that it's reacting to Saccharomyces boulardii or citric acid or whatever else? It takes a lot for that gut to get to a place where it is that dysfunctional. At that point, depending on, for instance, even some of the compounds in the Miraca. And I have yet to understand exactly what happens other than the fact that it does happen. Cat's claw more so. You get a immune system, and I don't know the exact details, and I've tried asking. No one seems to totally understand this. You get an immune system that's so unstable that it seems like anything and everything could peeve it off. You find food colorings and parasites and all kinds of other things become. And the easiest way to look at it is we've got a spectrum. You've got the kids who are the most dysregulated and have the worst dysfunctional guts, and then the kids that have some imbalances, but it's not that bad. The kids that are over here, you give them American histamine digest, chances are the amount of symptom improvement you're going to see is actually pretty impressive. And then you've got the kids that are on this side where you poke their immune system, you're not careful, and all of a sudden things fall apart. I hope that that was helpful. Do you think the mold toxins disrupt the gut lining 100%? And that is why we get the endotoxemia? Absolutely. That's what the next presentation is going to talk about in detail. What else here? Yes, this is basically a mast cell histamine trial. Trying to see, was there anything else? So 2 times loading dose for the Miraca. So this actually, I've become friends with the CEO of Young Nutra, who makes Miraca, and I have no affiliation with them. What she found in her trials was Miraca tends to work best if you do a loading dose. So you get higher doses in for a period of time, and then you drop it down, because essentially what you're doing is you're creating a mast cell stabilization, and you're indirectly and directly down regulating the microglia. And by doing that, you're also decreasing the amount of inflammation in the gut, which is further driving some of these abnormalities. So based on her feedback, I actually started doing that rather than just a steady course. And I actually found the kids really did do better. Most of the kids tolerate it very, very well. And what it does is it just expedites how quickly you'll see the results. Families that are a little bit hesitant, they're not sure, you can just start them slow and just expect it to take a little bit longer. Billy, I saw your comment there. Yeah, so part of why there was a question about LabCorp not always getting covered. I think if you justify some of the basic tests, and we're going to talk about that, like what tests to look for and what things like, I actually, if you guys caught what Emily talked about with the Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is actually a inflammatory bowel disease marker. I test that all the time in the kids. And I use that as a surrogate to see how, I hate to say it, jacked up this child's gut is. Because if you're seeing Saccharomyces cerevisiae antibodies, chances are the amount of gastrointestinal disruption is quite high. There are some of these tests that you can justify. Honestly, I've started using ALLOTest because, one, I find them to be very reliable. And if I see an antibody reaction past their level 4, the likelihood of exposure is very high, either actively or in the past. And you don't run into these scenarios where you do the test and the family comes back and says, "Hey, why did I get stuck with a $300 bill?" Um, so Rupa Health, I don't know about my Myco lab. One of the things for some of you who can't order serum testing directly, if you have used Rupa Health, and I have no affiliation with them either, they do have practitioners that can basically sign off on doing the tests. So if you ever needed that tool, that's available. And they also have phlebotomists that are everywhere. I appreciate the other comment about LabCorp not getting covered. Uh, so there's a question about higher incidence of flood in certain areas, and could that be tied to autism? So, I mean, yeah, like sadly, flooding is happening everywhere. There was a study out of New Orleans. I'll touch on this in one of the future presentations where they looked at what were the rates of autism following the floods. And what they found was that the rates of autism tripled in New Orleans because of that. Now, the authors of that study believed that the reason why the rates of autism went up was because of the psychological stress that the families endured as a result of the flooding. And I don't discount that to be a possibility. My take on that is flooding, especially in poverty-prone areas, is a perfect recipe for mountains of mold being grown, because you sure as hell know that New Orleans was not the place that was having, tip-top remediation, right? Those poor families could barely afford, food and barely living. So they patched together their homes the best as they could, presuming they even had their own home and they weren't renting from someone else that didn't give a hoot. Those became saunas, for mold. And I sadly think we're going to see much higher presentations of this down the road. See if there's any other questions. I've seen lipopolysaccharides cause severe neurological issues. Yeah, it's terrifying what these things do. And if any of you are interested in the interim between now and part 3, just start doing your own research. Type in, lipopolysaccharides and bacterial endotoxins in neurodegenerative disease, neuroinflammation, neuronal damage. I mean, just the studies that are out there, and there are a lot of them. It's terrifying. I mean, it's literally the most terrifying thing that I've encountered. And I thought like mycotoxins were scary, but these things are at a whole other level. And when you also look at the studies, we'll touch on this in the next presentation. When you look at the levels of endotoxins that become at play when certain things happen, then you start realizing that, oh my God, what we've called mold toxicity has probably been bacterial endotoxemia all along. We just have never had effective tools to assess for it. So there's a conversation from Dr. Steffi here, and he says, I'm just a neuro-optometrist trying to do my best. First of all, you guys just being here is a lot. And if you start implementing these simple steps, that's just try the Mirica and histamine, have families start doing this dust test, or for those of you that are more experienced and you have orientation with one of the other armories, just start taking these simple steps. And these simple steps in of themselves will take your patients probably further along than many of them have experienced with the most sophisticated detox protocols out there, the fanciest regimens that have been out there. And frankly, the reason why I've distilled my own practice down to this is I'm finding with 5 supplements and 1 or 2 additional treatments, I'm getting better results than when I was using 15 to 20 supplements. And I was supporting glucuronidation and sulfation and biofunction and this and that. And it's not to say those things are not necessary or helpful by any means. But what I'm finding is by just focusing on very key areas of inflammation and key areas that are driving toxicity and key areas driving gut permeability. And you'll see in the next discussion how these mast cells drive dysbiosis, how these mast cells drive gut inflammation, and how all of this comes together you'll see what this Mirica and histamine digest do, because it's not just the simple like, oh, we're kind of stabilizing the mast cells to improve the brain. We're literally starting to reorient the gut immune response through very, very simple tools. Um, all right. Any other questions?
You mentioned the DAO from Spain, is it?
Mhm.
Is there a certain name and
Yeah.
address for that?
Yeah. Nature DAO. So NATURDAO.
Okay.
You'll find it on Amazon in tablets.
Yeah.
In Spain, you'll see it'll come up Naturitas. In it's a vendor out of Spain that they'll ship to the US. I don't think they either charge like $5, or if you spend enough money, it's free. It's actually way less expensive than all the histamine products in the US, and it works. And it's vegan for those of you where that matters. It just takes time to
Thank
get,
you.
of course. Any other questions? Okay, well, I'm grateful that you all took the time to join me. I'm excited to see what you find, and I really want to encourage you all to ask a lot of questions, start probing these things, start looking at these things, and just asking yourself, well, how does this make sense? How does that make sense? Well, two, start testing the environment. Three, if you can, start testing your patients. And if there's one thing you do more than anything, start these supplements on at least 10 of your patients. I want all of you to just do a very simple protocol on a handful of your patients where you suspect this, and I just want you to see what happens, because it only takes a handful of patients to do better. And at that point, the amount of change you may see with this ridiculously simple protocol will impress you and help you better understand how all of this comes together. And all the future presentations where I get more into the microglia, more into the mast cells, and how they mediate all of these things, you'll see in real life how that's presenting in your patients. And you'll also see in real life how this basic treatment protocol makes a difference. Because that's, at the end of the day, that's the main thing, right? We're all here because there's way too many kids who are sick. There's way too many kids who are struggling, and we need to do more to help them. And I'm grateful that you guys are here, and looking forward to seeing how you all can make an even bigger difference in the lives of these kids. So you all be well. We'll be in touch, and please start posting questions to the forum, start posting cases to the forum, start asking questions there, and let's get a lot of kids better together. Bye, everyone.